My name is Stephen Brooks. I'm a professor of government here. I've been teaching here for 9 years. I teach classes on international relations. I think because I teach classes on international relations is one reason I was asked to introduce Dr. Stockton today. The other reason is I happen to have known him for almost 20 years, and so it's a real genuine pleasure to welcome him, and I can also genuinely say, having known him for this amount of time, that I genuinely look forward to what he has to say, because he's always very interesting. Before giving you some background about Dr. Stockton, I want to first thank the co-sponsors for this event, the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences, and the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. I'd just like to say that Dartmouth is very lucky to have both of these centers here, and that both of them are in a position to sponsor excellent speakers like Dr. Stockton. And I know when I found out that Dr. Stockton was interested in speaking here, I emailed Sadhna Hall and Chris Wolforth about this, and they emailed me back in like 2 hours, so I'd like to thank them, and also Ken Yalwis and Andrew Samwick for their support in bringing Dr. Stockton here. Now, this is not the only speaker that they are sponsoring, and so what I'd also do is encourage you to look at their websites to see what other speakers they're bringing to campus. It's dickey.dartmouth.edu and rockefeller.dartmouth.edu. So now let me introduce Dr. Stockton. He has a long title, here it goes, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and America's Security Affairs. For those of you who are not familiar with the organizational chart for the Department of Defense, the bottom line is he's very, very high up in the organization. And that's why we're very lucky to have him here today. He received his PhD from Harvard in 1986. After receiving his doctorate, Dr. Stockton served for 3 years as the Chief Foreign Policy Aide to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And then in 1990, he joined the faculty of the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, which is where I met him. Besides being a faculty member at the Naval Postgraduate School, he also served in a number of important administration positions within the school, including the director of the Center for Civil Military Relations, the dean of the School of International Studies, and the director of the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. In 2006, Dr. Stockton then moved to Stanford University, where he was appointed a senior research scholar. A point I'd just like to stress to you is that Dr. Stockton is one of the very small number of people who is capable and has worked at very high levels at both academia and the policymaking world. As a scholar, Dr. Stockton has been a very prominent leader of the effort to develop a research agenda on homeland security issues. And as part of this effort, he helped establish the journal Homeland Security Affairs. Let me conclude by noting one more very important aspect of his biography, which is that he graduated from Dartmouth in 1976. I know many of my own students are here today. And I know that many of you who have been in my classes have heard me say that it is crucial that all of you learn to think very critically and very carefully about international affairs. And you know, one thing I always say is that a reason why you have to learn to think critically about international affairs is that some of you will someday go on to very important positions deciding what happens in this world today. Well, Dr. Stockton obviously illustrates this dynamic. A little more than 30 years ago, he too was a Dartmouth student. And so in addition to learning to this lecture, I hope that all the students who are here today look to him as an example and redouble their effort to learn how to think critically about the world and America's place within it. And with that, welcome Dr. Stockton. I hope you will welcome him warmly.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks to everybody at Dartmouth College that made my visit here possible. It's great to be back, to see old friends, to savor the aroma in Harriet's basement once again, and above all, to watch Dartmouth crush Penn on Saturday. But of course, I'm here to do more than that. I want to talk about some of the challenges that I face in preparing for the worst kinds of disasters. I want to share some policy puzzles that I confront in the Pentagon and with my partners across the nation and internationally. I want to talk about some of the preliminary progress that we're making. And then finally, I want to get your insights on the way ahead. Some of these challenges remain to be resolved, and both listening to students and faculty today, I hope to go back to the Pentagon smarter than I was. Let me give you a little roadmap for my remarks today. First of all, I want to give you a preliminary overview of the policy challenges I want to address tonight and the way those challenges pair up with my responsibilities in serving the Secretary of Defense. Secondly, I want to examine the problems of preparing for catastrophes more closely in two realms, domestically and also internationally. And then finally, I want to conclude by looking at an especially important realm in which progress can be made, one in which all of you bear a key responsibility. Let me start now with an overview of the problem. Months ago, when I talked to Steve about the possibility I might have the honor to come here and speak with you, I picked out this problem because it loomed so large in my portfolio. Little did I know that shortly before coming here, we'd have terrible tsunamis in American Samoa, earthquakes in, we can get earthquakes in Sonoma too, as you well know, earthquakes in Indonesia. Topic of catastrophes is very, very timely right now. And again, in two dimensions, both here at home and internationally. And that lines up very, very well with my responsibilities in serving Secretary of Defense Gates, Deputy Secretary Bill Lynn, Dartmouth class of '76, and Undersecretary for Policy Michelle Flournoy. Steve gave you my excessively long job title. I am the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and America's Security Affairs. America's Security Affairs means I'm responsible for supporting the Secretary of Defense for all policy issues in the security realm in the Western Hemisphere, from Canada and the Arctic all the way down to the Southern Cone, Chile and Argentina. There are a lot of opportunities for collaboration with these partner nations in getting prepared together to face catastrophes, being prepared to assist each other when the worst happens. And I've got some specific comments that I want to raise with you today, some challenges that lie ahead. But I'd like to start instead with the domestic part of my portfolio, that Homeland Defense portfolio. I am responsible for the defense of the United States homeland, and we can talk about some of those issues as they involve terrorism, other kinds of threats, if you'd like, in the question and answer period. But I'm also responsible for something called Defense Support to Civil Authorities. DSCA, we call it. That's our responsibility to support civilian authorities for response to and preparedness for catastrophes. And that's where I'd like to start my remarks today. Let me first make sure that everybody understands the way the United States is structured to respond to catastrophes. It's tempting to think that when bad things happen, the Department of Defense is going to be in the lead. DOD would come to the rescue. And it's understandable why some people might think that would be the case, because the women and men of the Department of Defense are incredibly well trained. I'm so proud of our soldiers, sailors, and airmen. And because the Department of Defense has terrific capabilities that in some cases you'd think might be able to be brought to bear in disaster response. And that's true. But what is not true is that the Department of Defense is in the lead. DOD is not in the lead. We are in support of civil authorities. Let me describe that system for you a little bit so you understand it. It's a bottom-up system. When a disaster happens, above all, U.S. citizens, the people in this room, you're responsible for your own selves. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands now in terms of who's got plenty of bottled water at home, who's got everything else they need in case a terrible ice storm were to hit this winter. Power would go down, and you'd be on your own, except for Mother Dartmouth, of course. Citizen preparedness is very important, and the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Napolitano, and the administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Craig Fugate, are putting new emphasis on helping citizens take responsibility for their own ability to survive, turn them survivors instead of making them victims the next time a Katrina equivalent catastrophe strikes. So citizens are critical to this. Next level up are terrific first responders, both in the Upper Valley and across the United States. Firefighters, law enforcement, public health, everybody that's part of that first responder team, people in the community who've had specialized training and can serve. Next level up, counties and states. Governors, as I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the future, have special responsibilities for the public safety of their citizens. States assist local authorities when local authorities are overwhelmed. And then, as necessary, if states' capabilities are inadequate for catastrophe, reach out to other states. So, New Hampshire would reach across to Vermont, to Massachusetts for assistance to come in. And then finally, if that's still not enough, the federal government comes to provide additional assistance. Above all, the Department of Homeland Security. And then very much at the end, the Department of Defense providing its special capabilities in support of civil authorities. This system works great for what I call normal disasters. The disasters that we have a lot of experience in dealing with because they happen all the time. What I'd like to focus my remarks on today is something very different, and that is the worst kind of catastrophes. Catastrophes like the New Madrid fault, doing what it did 100 years ago when that fault in the center of the United States was so severe it reversed the flow of the Mississippi River in an earthquake. Think about that. We're due for another New Madrid fault. I mentioned before Sonoma has an earthquake possibility. All across the United States, there are risks of, let's call them the bad catastrophes as opposed to your garden variety disasters. There are a couple special problems in preparing for such an event, and I want to talk to them now. First of all, there's the problem of not being ready in terms of planning and capabilities. The thing to be avoided are pickup games, where people like myself have to make things up on the fly, deal with catastrophes for which we haven't prepared in terms of figuring out the capabilities we need, the plans that we have to provide support. I'm going to offer a few insights about how we're trying to avoid pickup games in the future for events that haven't yet struck. But there's something more interesting to me as a political scientist, and that is how we glue the system together to work effectively given the structure of American government and the nature of this bottom-up system. One of the things that I learned early on when I was introduced to this business is that we don't have a direct line of authority that goes from the president to governors to mayors and then down to the community level. It doesn't work like that under our Constitution. Governors don't work for the president. They are independently elected, sovereign chief executives of their respective states. Governors don't work for the president. And mayors really don't work for the governor. I got a snootful of this when I had the honor of serving Senator Moynihan in the United States Senate, senator from New York, where I would be lobbied by two very different groups of folks simultaneously. Albany, the state government of New York, versus the city of New York, wanting sometimes entirely different things, going after each other's throats. Mayors don't work for governors. Governors don't work for the president. And so what you have here is a need for everybody to work together as a team, to have what we call unity of effort in response to a catastrophe, in the absence of that kind of unity in the political system. Our founding fathers designed a system that lacks this kind of unity for very good reasons, which we can talk about with our political theorist friends in the audience later. But the political reality is authority is fragmented inside the United States under our Constitution, not by accident, but by design. And so we need to build a catastrophic response system that fits the reality that governors and the president both have independent grants of authority under the United States Constitution. How do you build a system that provides for unity of effort when the political system that we have to deal with distributes that authority so widely? Let me first start with the relatively easy stuff, and that is how to avoid the pickup game. How to anticipate disasters before they happen at a scale where we're not ever going to get much practice. How do we do that? There are a couple of particular things that are important to do. First of all, we learned some harsh lessons in Hurricane Katrina. And we're making some progress. One of the lessons that we learned was that in anticipation of a disaster, the last thing you need to be doing is sitting on your hands. You want to be able to imagine in advance what kinds of federal capabilities are most likely to be called upon by states if states are overwhelmed and their neighboring states can't get the job done either. We can figure this out in advance, and we must. The Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act called on the Department of Defense to start figuring this out, to work in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA to have what we called prescripted mission assignments, to figure out what kinds of capabilities are most likely to be needed in advance. So after the catastrophe strikes and American citizens need assistance in an urgent way, we are already ready to go with an understanding of what kind of airlift is most likely to be needed. What kinds of command and control support are necessary when all these aircraft are flying around bringing in supplies and maybe the local airport isn't functioning anymore because of the catastrophic effects on their own air control tower. There's a whole long list of ways in which we can pre-script the kind of assistance that we provide, and we're well underway on that process. That's relatively easy. A bigger challenge is in planning. Now, I agree with the old saying, actually it's not so old, Winston Churchill made it up, that no plan withstands first contact with the enemy. And that's true in catastrophic planning as well. You can do all the planning you want, but then when the event happens, you need to adjust. You can't be locked into what you thought was going to happen and what you thought you needed to do. Nevertheless, planning is absolutely vital in anticipation of an event, so you know who is going to do what and how you're going to work together in this fragmented political system. Absolutely vital. We've been making some progress in this regard, but I'll tell you, we are nowhere near where we need to be in two dimensions. First of all, across the federal government. It won't surprise you to know that every federal department has its own way of doing planning. So the Department of Defense, we imagine that we're ahead of some other departments. Sometimes that's true, maybe. A lot of times maybe we still have plenty to learn. But the Department of Defense, because of its war-fighting mission, has been planning for decades and refining its planning system. Department of Homeland Security, brand new department after 9/11. They're still building their planning system. It's good, but it's different from ours. And then you have the Department of Health and Human Services. We'd be in support of Secretary Sebelius, we in the Department of Defense, if H1N1 turned out to be much worse than we hope it will be. They've got their own planning system. Department of Agriculture, in case there was a terrible agro-terrorism event, they've got their own planning system. It makes it very hard to build that unity of effort across the federal government. So what we're trying to do now is build an integrated planning system so that we're all talking the same language and we can collaborate before the event strikes instead of making it up in the aftermath of the catastrophe hitting. Very, very difficult. We're not where we need to be yet, and I'd be happy to talk about this challenge in greater detail, but it boils out to something that all of you are familiar with. Bureaucracies don't like to change. Innovation is synonymous with evil in all too many respects. And so to build a genuine integrated planning system is something on which I'm focusing a lot of attention. Secondly, in addition to planning, in the horizontal realm, across the federal government, we need to do much more to build planning in the vertical dimension, federal, state, local. And again, why is this so critical? It's because we have a bottom-up system. We have a bottom-up system. And if we don't have effective integration for plans, local, state, and federal, then again, it'll be a pickup game. We have a number of initiatives underway in partnership with FEMA in order to improve this vertical dimension of planning integration. Above all, the Task Force for Emergency Readiness, where state-level planners are partnering together with National Guard folks in their own states with special expertise in DoD-style planning to get ready for the equivalent of New Madrid. So people are reading off the same playbook, and so that playbook represents what's needed from the local perspective and not merely the federal perspective. Then, in addition to planning, we've got an exercise system that we're trying to build. My phrase that I like to use, if you can't exercise it, it isn't real. Exercising, practicing, is absolutely vital to strengthening preparedness for catastrophes for a couple reasons. First of all, when you exercise against a scenario like the New Madrid fault, you find out where the gaps are. You find out what the problems are. You're in discovery mode. You find out, here's an area in which we hadn't planned for collaboration. Here's some capabilities we're being asked to come up with in this exercise by state and local authorities, and we hadn't figured that out. So it's excellent as a discovery tool, and then it's terrific as a way to practice and get better, build your capabilities. And all too often, that hasn't happened yet. We need exercises that stress the system, that doesn't make the exercise participants look good to each other and paper over potential flaws. We need exercises that put us in uncomfortable positions as federal bureaucrats, that make us examine the most difficult challenges, take us to the breaking point, get us out of the realm where we've had plenty of practice and into the realm where we are identifying problems and building ways of solving them well in advance of the event occurring. Another realm in which we're making progress, what I'm especially proud of, is that of technology sharing. Members of Congress had a critical insight in 2003. They realized that as the Department of Defense was building new technologies, new capabilities for fighting wars abroad, that some of those capabilities, some of that technology could be of value here in the United States. So, for example, there's been terrific progress in the defense medical community on wound treatment. Unfortunately, given the wars we've been fighting, there's been plenty of need to strengthen our ability to deal with wounded warriors. Some of those same treatment capabilities and technologies now we're sharing with first responders across the nation. And there are a whole range of other things that we're sharing right now. For example, improvised IEDs, improvised explosive devices. They're happening abroad. Is there some risk they could happen here? You see from the newspaper, you bet there are possibilities for that. So let's bring some of that detection and prevention technology that we've honed fighting wars abroad back to the United States to help secure American citizens here at home. It's a prime example about how the American taxpayer gets a twofer. We're not only better executing missions abroad, but we can bring that technology to bear here in the United States. But these are the relatively easy things to do in anticipation of catastrophes. Now I want to talk about the most difficult challenges, and ones where I'm hoping that you'll be able to provide me with some insights. It goes back to the political dynamics of catastrophic response. You remember a few moments ago when I talked about the way that we're structured in a bottom-up fashion to respond to disasters. Bottom-up, local, state, and last federal, and last the Department of Defense. That's not only enshrined in the Constitution, where governors are responsible for the public safety of their citizens. It's not only something that we need to follow because it's in the Constitution, it makes darn good sense. Why is it that we'd want this bottom-up system? Answer is simple. Folks in the community of Hanover, the Upper Valley, folks in communities around the nation are best prepared to understand what their own challenges are in disaster response. They know each other. They know the challenges in the community, the special vulnerabilities that might exist to natural hazards. Because they're part of the community, they have the local wisdom, the expertise, and the personal relationships needed to make the disaster response system work. The bottom-up system is effective because it puts decision-making authority in the hands of the people who are best prepared, most qualified, and smartest about local requirements. So thank goodness we have the system that we do. But as we move up that catastrophic scale of destructiveness from what I call normal disasters to the most challenging kinds of events, then that political complexity does rear its head once again, and in an especially interesting realm. And that is the realm of policymaking. What do I mean by this? Well, policymaking is a funny thing. Those of us who are federal bureaucrats really do sometimes think that wisdom tends to flow outward from the Beltway. Of course that's not true. That's a ridiculous assumption. Somehow, despite repeated lessons that that's not true, sometimes we still believe it. But when it comes to making national policy to build a catastrophic system, we need to do a better job of taking that lesson to heart. Too often there's an assumption in the past in Washington that the federal government is going to make up policy. The federal government will design a catastrophic response system, for example, and then will tell the states and localities how it ought to function, and they'll get on board, and then we'll be all set to go. That is totally wrong. Totally wrong. We need to capture the wisdom of states and localities, not only in implementing disaster preparedness policy, but in shaping it. We need to have the views of those who have the most wisdom about disaster response, shaping the biggest components of national policy in a way that looks nothing like we'd ordinarily make foreign policy or defense policy, where that lies within the purview of the federal government, Congress, and the executive branch together. I'm arguing that although they are essential partners in this enterprise, we also need to bring states and localities into the shaping of policy and not merely its execution. This is a challenge. There's no real precedent for it. As a scholar, I've tried to search for precedents in completely different realms, and there's not much there. A little bit in trade policy. This is true innovation, and it's driven by necessity. We have an important first component of progress in this regard, and that is the requirement that Congress has imposed on me to establish a Council of Governors. That is, a panel of governors that will advise the Secretary of Defense, bring state perspectives to bear as we shape policy as part of the interagency process in Washington, D.C. It's an absolutely terrific step forward to have governors actively, substantively participate in the shaping of federal policy on disaster response. I look forward to having that Council of Governors stand up very, very soon. But there are all kinds of other ways in which we need to bring states and localities effectively into the policymaking process. Secretary Napolitano and Administrator Fugate are doing so now. It's my responsibility on my own portfolio to make that happen. We're embarking on a new adventure in the way the United States is governed in this realm of catastrophic preparedness. Let me move on now to the international realm. I said before that my job has two components. I'm responsible for all these things inside the United States, but also I take very seriously my responsibilities for policy in the security realm towards the Western Hemisphere, Canada to Chile and Argentina, and also globally to help U.S. partners around the world build up their own capacity to respond to disasters and to be able to partner together with them in mutual support when catastrophes strike. So America Samoa is a prime example. American Samoa, American territory, FEMA is busy there now with a little bit of Department of Defense support to help the locals and Governor Telefono make sure that American Samoa is brought back to where it needs to be. But right across the international line, just a very few miles away, we have Samoa proper. We have the other states in the region that were hit just as hard. They're receiving assistance from New Zealand under pre-existing emergency assistance packs. We're coordinating with New Zealand. We're standing by to help in Indonesia in the aftermath of the earthquake. We need to think about the shared challenges that disaster preparedness confronts us with and the way partners can assist each other. Closest to home, that means Canada and Mexico. Some Americans have forgotten, but we need to remember the valuable help that the government of Mexico provided to the United States citizens of New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina, where massive convoys of trucks came north from Mexico with food and water, direct assistance, and in subsequent hurricanes as well. There's much more we can do in mutual support with Mexico. And here in New Hampshire, closer to Canada, again, lots of good models of collaboration, lots more that we can do. In fact, on Monday, I'm going to Ottawa to discuss some very concrete ways in which Canada and the United States can be even more effectively prepared to provide for mutual support when catastrophes cross borders and don't respect these artfully built mechanisms of government that we've respectively erected inside our own countries. Mexico, Canada, globally, there's much more we can do to work together with international partners in preparedness for disasters. And I'll be happy to talk about some very specific examples, if you'd like, during question and answer. But now I'd like to turn to the third portion of my discussion, and that is especially significant opportunity to make progress in disaster preparedness, and the one on which we depend for you. And that is the need for you to devote your lives to public service in whatever career path that you choose to follow. Now, not all of you are going to have the pleasure of serving in what I like to call the five-sided squirrel cage. Although around the Pentagon, the girdled earth equivalent exists, right? There's a girdle around the Pentagon of Dartmouth expertise. As I mentioned, my classmate, Bill Lynn, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. It's absolutely terrific to have him there. We have Bob Martinage, colleague of mine in the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. Eric Fanning in the Department of the Navy, class of 90 and 91, respectively. It's terrific to have the Dartmouth expertise inside the Department of Defense and the public policy perspectives that Dartmouth prepares you to bring to bear. But that's true all across the federal government. In Health and Human Services, in the Department of Agriculture, in Homeland Security. There are terrific opportunities both immediately after you graduate and also over the longer term for you to serve. And it's not merely in government. The private sector plays an absolutely vital role in disaster preparedness today, and that role is going to grow in the future. When you look at what companies like Walmart are doing today to be able to bring their expertise and capabilities to bear in the aftermath of a disaster, water and other supplies, their distribution system is superior, right? We all know that. To bring that to bear in support of disaster response is a terrific advantage to the nation. Those of you who go into business in the private sector, you'll be interested in problems of continuity of operations when catastrophes strike businesses as well. There's a whole realm in the private sector, and then in non-governmental organizations. Faith-based organizations, the Red Cross, terrific opportunities to serve there as well. So start thinking about that here, regardless of your major. If you're taking a major that's relatively easy, like engineering, physics, or if you want to get into the hard sciences, like government. No matter what path that you're following, please keep in mind that as we build the disaster preparedness system, it's people like you that we're going to be relying on for the new ideas, the creative approaches that help us prepare for the very worst of disasters so that when they strike, we can serve the American people in the way that we need to. Thanks very much. Sure.
All right, thanks very much. And as I noted, please, when you're asking your questions, stand up and wait for the microphone. I'll start on the left side. I'm also going to be focusing initially on questions from students. So students, get ready with your questions. And I would also like to say that Dr. Stockton is, of course, in addition to receiving questions on what he was just speaking about, he does have a very broad portfolio. We don't often have an Assistant Secretary of Defense here. So if you have questions about other aspects of defense policy, he promises to address those as well. So questions from students initially that I can call upon. Yes, right here. Please stand up.
Hi. I know you've been talking mostly about natural disasters and preparedness measures for that. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what policy measures are being taken to deal with things like nuclear terrorism, terrorist attacks, etc. Thanks.
Well, I'm glad you asked, because we can't prevent earthquakes or hurricanes, but there's a whole heck of a lot we can do to prevent attacks on the United States. And as with catastrophic response, we've got a great foundation on which to build and plenty of more work to be done. You've all been reading the newspapers, including America's oldest college newspaper, about the threats that exist to the United States today from non-state actors, and the risk that extremists can get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. This is a challenge that we take very, very seriously in the Department of Defense. And we're not only trying to deal with these challenges abroad, the women and men fighting abroad today, but here at home in my Homeland Defense portfolio. Again, the lion's share of what we do in my organization is work in support of those civilian authorities who are responsible for securing us against terrorist attack. So the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and not only at the federal level, but local and state authorities. We need to be in support of them, and we're working hard to do that even better than we are today. Let me give you a couple of specific examples. One in which I'd like to call attention is there's been much too slow progress in strengthening the flow of information to local and state law enforcement authorities who at the end of the day provide absolutely critical capabilities for the prevention of terrorism. The Obama administration is working hard to strengthen that flow of information. And one of the things that my organization has just done is build the pipe, if you will, build the flow of information so that classified information that we have in the Department of Defense on the bad guys can now be made available to state and local fusion centers where they bring intelligence to bear in support of local law enforcement. So this information about foreign adversaries, foreign terrorists, being brought to bear now in a way that helps strengthen the effectiveness of local and state law enforcement. We're all about that, building this partnership in the prevention realm as well as in catastrophic response. Thanks for your question.
Yes, can I have a right here in the green?
Good afternoon. Movies such as United 93 and Fahrenheit 9/11 illustrated the sort of political pickup game that happened after 9/11. And I was wondering if there was a pre-scripted plan in place in case, God forbid, there was a second 9/11. Can you speak more on how there would be a more effective federal response in the case of such a tragic event?
It would be a pleasure to address that. First of all, terrific progress has been made since 9/11. That was a harsh lesson for those of us in academia as well as in government. I personally have been focusing on, let's call them Cold War leftover security challenges instead of reshaping my own teaching and research agenda to deal with the threat to come. So I'm not here to cast blame or to look backwards. What I'd like to do is look forwards. There's terrific progress that's been made in the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and to a lesser extent because we have a support role in the Department of Defense. But we are totally focused not only on learning the lessons of 9/11 and being prepared for that sort of threat, but keeping always in mind that the adversary is smart and adaptive. And above all, that the adversary will pursue asymmetric strategies. What does that mean? The adversary is not going to build up the kinds of capabilities that we already have here in abundance and hit us head to head. Al-Qaeda did not need to build an air force to strike the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. They borrowed United Airlines. There are ways of maneuvering around the existing strengths of the United States military, asymmetrically challenging the United States, that provides the prime threat against us. One more thing I'd like you to keep in mind, that is, as in the case of 9/11, rather than building their own ways of attacking us, our adversaries can use U.S. infrastructure to get the job done. They use our air transportation system to attack us on 9/11. Is there a risk that our internet system could be used to launch attacks against the United States? The food distribution system? All the infrastructure that we've erected here? You bet. I'm not here to be alarmist. On the other hand, I do think that in the scholarly community and the policymaking community, we need to not underestimate the adversary and remember that although we have terrific strengths in the United States security system, the adversary is always seeking to maneuver around those strengths and to capitalize on what we view as what's wonderful about U.S. infrastructure, turn around and use that as a weapon against us. Now, as we look at ways to strengthen our preparedness against such attacks, we also need to keep in mind we are not going to do the terrorist jobs for them. Our adversaries would like nothing better than for us to throw civil liberties out the window or erect barriers to trade and commerce to keep terrorists out that would choke off economic growth and opportunity to make economic progress possible in this country, especially for the poorest. We're not going to give the terrorists an easy win. We're going to build a security system that simultaneously strengthens our ability to defend our civil liberties and provide for economic growth. That's, again, why we need a strong research agenda by students and faculty at leading colleges like Dartmouth, so that you can bring those ideas in on how to square the circle, how to take things that look like they're diametrically opposed and bring them into a cohesive, unified approach, to have economic growth and strong security at our ports, to have the flow of intelligence information that we need to stop attacks by bad guys and simultaneously protect the privacy of American citizens. That's the challenge, bringing those seeming opposites into an integrated whole. Thanks.
All right, I saw a question here in the third row.
Thank you for coming. In view of Iran and North Korea's increased hostility in recent months and their steady progress on their nuclear and ballistic missile programs, how do you assess or justify the Obama administration's reduction in our goals for ballistic missile defense and that capacity for the United States' protection?
The question that you've raised, I'd phrase it a little bit differently. And that is, how is the administration, including the Secretary of Defense, taken into account changes in the nature of the threat, the ballistic missile threat, and therefore adjusted our ballistic missile defense policy? Going back, looking all the way back into the Cold War, at the evolution of U.S. ballistic missile defense policy, the requirement has always been there, not only in terms of anticipating what the threat might hold, but as we get a better understanding of what adversary capabilities actually look like in Iran and elsewhere, to adjust our own ballistic missile defense plans accordingly. And that's what's happening in terms of U.S. planning. That is, the Department of Defense has very carefully looked at the evolution of Iranian capabilities, the degree to which those tend to be short and medium range currently, as opposed to longer range, and adjusted our plans accordingly. Being driven by the facts, being driven by very careful analysis of capabilities in other countries, that's the touchstone of decision-making under this administration, and it's something of which I'm very proud.
Yes, additional questions right here in the front row.
Good evening, and thank you for coming, because it's truly been a pleasure. My question came when you stated that in the Constitution that the lack of speed in communication is because it's written into the Constitution, well, in government. And I was wondering, are there any policies being created to undo this? And in some ways, is it possible to build a stronger communication between governments and business bureaus without policies created?
Well, that's a great question. And I love it that our founding fathers divided authority in the way they did, initially as a check against tyranny. One of the paradoxes that you've been learning about here in the United States government is that power is divided. Power is often shared in foreign policy, where different branches of the government need to collaborate in order to make something significant happen. That division of authority, that sharing of authority, makes sometimes for a less efficient decision-making process. If we had a dictatorship, heaven forbid, decision-making would go much more expeditiously. But fortunately, our founding fathers divided authority in the way they did, because it produces a much better decision at the end of the game. And this presents a special problem in the realm that we've been talking about today. Because in disaster response, expeditiousness is the coin of the realm. We need to be able to ensure that the assistance that American citizens need get there fast and effectively in a way that saves lives, potentially on a very, very large scale. So citizen responsibility comes first. I meant what I said about being prepared for a catastrophic ice storm here in the Upper Valley when power would go out. But we also need to think about how to build that speed into the system for a disaster response, federal, state, and local, despite the distribution of authority that our Constitution has. That's again why this is such a big challenge. It's again why it makes it so important for us to plan, to exercise, to prepare for working together in a collaborative way, even though authority is divided by our Constitution, both across the federal government and between the federal government and the states.
Next question. Can we do it in the back here?
First, thank you for coming out tonight. And throughout your entire speech, you've been stressing the need to plan, predict, and exercise, which I understand. But how do you prepare yourself for the events that simply just come out of the blue? I mean, I understand that studying the past and predicting the future are very worthwhile, but things are going to happen that we just can't foresee. How do you prepare for the unpreparable, basically?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I'm going to give you my answer, and it reflects my own experience, and that is, above all, no fooling, a liberal arts education that enables you to think critically, to assimilate new ideas very, very quickly, and to be able to think about how different parts of the puzzle are going to fit together. It's very easy in the bureaucracy to look at your own stovepipe, to imagine how things are supposed to work. When an unexpected event shatters your standard operating procedures, the way in which you've planned to work, you need to be able to think creatively about the big picture and to be adaptive in a way that sometimes drilling down into a particular discipline won't prepare you. So I like to think that we ought to be thinking about the unthinkable right now. There are a range of catastrophes that are eminently predictable. We know that terrible hurricanes are going to strike the East Coast. We know that's going to happen. And potentially worse than Hurricane Katrina. Let's get ready. We know that the New Madrid Fault, the Hayward Fault in California, they are ready to go. We know that's going to happen. We know that as climate change continues, there's increasing likelihood that storms will become more severe. This is coming down the pike. So let's get ready for those eminently predictable things, but let's also retain our creativity and our ability to improvise when absolutely necessary. And I think what you're getting here by way of education helps prepare you for that.
Oh, yes. Question right here in the back. Stand up, please.
You said something along the lines that the American political structure doesn't promote unity across different agencies. Well, what specifically is your office doing right now to promote unity between the state, local, federal levels of government?
Let me talk first about across the federal government, and then we'll talk federal, state, and local. Across the federal government, President Obama has brought a terrific new team together that's made collaboration one of the very most important priorities that exist today. So we have a shared sense of mission that's driving efforts like the integrated planning system to do things that the previous administration started. Terrific foundation. We're going to build on that foundation now and bring it to conclusion, even though the challenges in a bureaucracy are enormous. Federal, state, and local is even tougher in some ways, as I said before. There's no paradigm that we can borrow from for how national policy can be made in the ways I've been discussing today. The Council of Governors, giving governors a seat at the table for genuine national decision-making, is the first step towards building integration in a way that hasn't existed before. It's a great adventure. It promises to have terrific payoffs. It's something in which I've got a personal interest as a political scientist, because one of the things about the United States government that's so wonderful is that although the Constitution remains fixed, there's been a history in this country for hundreds of years now of enormous ingenuity and adaptivity so that we can meet unforeseen challenges. It's a great time to be serving in the Department of Defense.
Next question, right up here in the third row.
Thank you. One of the things you spoke about early on, which was a great remark, you said bureaucracies didn't like change and that innovation was evil, or so they saw it. Are you worried that any system that you are able to put in place may become bureaucratic and resistant to change?
Well, first of all, let's praise bureaucracies, because there's plenty of good about them, and I'm sure Dr. Masters, other folks have helped you understand that from a Weberian perspective, we want bureaucracies because they provide for regularized decision-making. They provide for a concreteness to policy as opposed to the whims of a tyrant. Bureaucracies are good precisely because they tend to stay in pre-existing lanes. So all praise to bureaucracies. Nevertheless, this has a clear downside, doesn't it? And so the advantage that we have now in terms of overcoming organizational inertia is we have a Secretary of Defense who's interested, who presses out-of-the-box thinking, creative approaches to solving America's security challenges, to, for example, looking at how the potential capabilities of other nations in ballistic missile capabilities are evolving, and come up with a very different answer than existed before. It's a fascinating process to watch as a political scientist, but as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and America's security affairs, it's a terrific opportunity for me and the colleagues with whom I work to not be bound by pre-existing policies and organizational arrangements, and to think how we can do things better rather than having the dead hand of the past continue to press down upon us.
The next question. Are there any other student questions? Right here, in third row.
Yes. What are the United States' plans if Israel attacks Iran?
Can I please have some tough questions here? That gets the shortest answer of the night. I don't know. But I do know that President Obama is working together with the leadership of Israel and all of our partners to try to find peaceful ways of resolving the tensions that exist in that part of the world. I apologize, genuinely not my portfolio.
See one more student question in the third row here.
I wrote this down. Thank you for coming. I live in California near the Hayward Fault, and you emphasize that in this bottom-up system of preparedness, we as citizens of the United States are first in lead in protecting ourselves. But it seems that most law-abiding, tax-paying citizens do not maintain this same responsibility model. So how do you communicate this message, and beyond that, how do you incentivize citizens themselves to take on this responsibility as opposed to them following the quote-unquote logical response of seeing that responsibility in other public equities like the police force or other stuff like that?
I'm going to have a little fun here now. Obviously, you've had plenty of time to think about the question. You wrote it down. So I'm going to ask you, what are you doing as an American citizen to be prepared? Which dorm or house do you live in?
I live in North Mass.
North Mass, okay. So even though Thayer is very, very close, you probably ought to have some kind of provision of water, some kind of food, maybe even better than Thayer food in case of an emergency. Is your dormitory organized? Is Mass organized in terms of looking out for each other? He's thinking he's sorry he asked this question now.
What I'm trying to say is that I think most people who pay taxes, who would say that they are part of this citizen base, would find that because they pay taxes, because they have contributed in some economic sense or other equitable sense, that the United States would have that responsibility to take care of ourselves.
I think that's fine, but I would emphasize something that you might call an ugly truth. The reality is that we, as citizens, are our own first responders. When a disaster strikes, we're responsible for the first few hours, for sure, and sometimes many more depending on circumstances, for ourselves and our families. Before law enforcement, before fire, before anybody else gets there, you're responsible for yourself. Don't be a victim, be a survivor. There's a lot you can do to achieve that transformation.
Okay, now I'm take some questions from the left side of the audience over here.
We have one more student question. Students come first at Dartmouth College.
All right. I can't possibly object to that.
Thank you. This is actually a question more about you. After you completed your studies, how did you find yourself drawn to this field of study? Like, why or what led you to the career path you're on today?
I love answering that question because I got a fellowship. I got a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship. There are resources here at Dartmouth that enable you to go down, be an intern in Washington, get into the realm of public policy, take on national security challenges, and start making a contribution very, very early on in your career. I had the opportunity to go to graduate school right away. I decided I'd go down to Washington, get into the belly of the beast a little bit, learn about how policy was actually made, take advantage of what I learned from my terrific professors here, and then go back to graduate school. There are lots of different ways of getting to where you need to go. That way worked for me, but I do insist that everybody here, regardless of what your career path ends up being, think about having some contribution to public service as some component of your life.
All right, there's a question, third or fourth row, way on the edge.
Hello, I'm a PhD candidate at Dartmouth College, and my research is centered around developing new technologies for emergency response. But it seems to me that a lot of these bureaucratic organizations have their own funding sources to create new technologies, but at the same time they seem very disconnected. So the Department of Defense has DARPA, CDC has BARDA, and they seem to be fighting or trying to fund the same thing, but at the same time they don't coordinate those efforts. And you talk about technology transfer between organizations. How is the Department of Defense promoting these?
There are a lot of opportunities for collaboration in precisely the realm that you've mentioned. All too often in grant assistance programs, in these kinds of funding of research, I think there are opportunities for us to do better than we're currently doing in terms of efficiency, mutual support, and to build a cross-governmental approach to solving these security challenges. We're making some progress, but I would hope that having had this experience now, that you will, in some portion of your career, come back and say, I was a victim of the current system. I want to help make it better. I've diagnosed the process by having experienced it. Let me contribute to the solution so we can build better unity of effort in this realm, in addition to the realms that we've been discussing already today.
Question here in near the back.
Thank you. A couple of times this afternoon you've touted the Defense Department's reanalysis of Iranian nuclear capabilities. I wonder, since you look like the kind of person who likes to quantify things, I wonder how you would quantify the reliability of that new analysis in light of such historical facts as the Soviet Union produced an atomic bomb long before we thought they would. The same was true of the hydrogen bomb. The North Koreans attacked the South when we were sure they wouldn't. The same was true when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait. Everybody said he wouldn't do it, and he did it. It just seems to me there's a history of palpable unreliability of these kinds of estimates. The military, as I understand it, calls it the estimate of the situation, not the certainty of the situation. So I just wonder if you could tell me, is it on a scale of 1 to 10, how accurate you think the administration's current view of Iranian nuclear capabilities is? Thank you.
I graduated from the government department before they forced us to do statistical analysis. It's a terrific advantage of being a dinosaur, class of '76. But it's a serious question, and it deserves a serious reply. The uncertainty of threat analysis always exists, and it goes in both directions. It's possible to wildly inflate the threat, to have an exaggerated understanding of what enemy capabilities were. So, for example, the alleged missile gap during the Cold War, President Kennedy came into office, discovered very quickly there was no missile gap. The United States was way ahead in terms of deployed and effective ICBMs. So on one hand, you have threat inflation. The problem with that, of course, is it can lead you to invest scarce resources where they're not needed at a time when other requirements are going unfunded. But you very rightly point out the flip side of that equation, and that is underestimate, don't imagine what the adversary might do. And that's especially important in my realm, in the Homeland Defense realm, where I don't expect terrorists to be building traditional military capabilities by virtue of the fact that they can't. And there's a terrific diffusion, for example, of biotechnology and sophisticated lab capabilities. We always need to be questioning our assumptions about what the nature of the threat is, to remember that the adversary is adaptive and creative, and to make sure that we take that into account despite the scarcity of resources, and to make sure that we hedge against, in a sane way, the possibility that in ballistic missile defense, or in my realm, we might not be getting it totally right. So those are the twin challenges that we need to hedge against in a way that makes good sense.
Now let me ask for any questions on this side of the audience before I turn it back to the students. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, sir. Earlier you mentioned the possibility of internet-based attacks and how that could create disastrous responses across state and international lines as well. The Obama administration early on said that this was a major priority in terms of shoring up the nation's information infrastructure and published a 60-day review, I think, back in the May timeframe, and said they were going to nominate a cyber czar, if you will. That position hasn't been nominated yet, and I think even the acting director may not be in place right now. How important do you think it is to actually set up this cyber czar, and what other types of things do you think would need to be done to create a good response to any possibility for an information attack?
Well, let me talk about the nature of the threat and how we need to address it. First of all, the challenges are serious, and it exemplifies the problems of Homeland Defense and Homeland Security in some important ways. Private sector owns the lion's share of the infrastructure in the United States, including the internet realm. And the United States government is not in a position, thank goodness, to dictate how infrastructure ought to be protected in most cases. Instead, we need a partnership that works together effectively with the private sector. That's true in this realm as well. But within the government, there's much more that we need to continue to do, and that involves integration, but it also involves taking care of our own houses. I'm responsible for the Secretary of Defense for defense critical infrastructure protection and mission assurance for the Department of Defense. That means, how can the Department of Defense be sure that it can execute its missions, including its ability to fight wars abroad? If the lights go out, if there's no electricity, we're in deep trouble for mission assurance. And there are critical defense production facilities that depend on the internet, all kinds of defense critical infrastructure that needs protection, where we have a lot of progress to make, not so much from the steady state, but again, going back to your question, we need to remember that the adversary is smart and adaptive. So what needs to be done? I'd urge you to take a look at the Department of Defense Public Affairs website today, because Bill Lynn, class of 76, just made some important policy pronouncements on cybersecurity. We're going to continue to move forward both inside of the Department of Defense and then in partnership with the White House and with our interagency partners. Thanks.
Next question. I saw one here near the back.
Thank you. Before you mentioned the Constitution and how its frame enables adapting to changing forces. However, what steps or measures has your department taken to protect civil liberties and freedom in light of such motions as the Patriot Act or otherwise, in order to protect not only the country but the liberties of the people?
Well, let me talk about the most sensitive challenge that we face in the Department of Defense, and that is the need to make sure that the Department of Defense is not spying on American citizens. Now, there is a challenge here because American military bases around the nation could face threats of attack by terrorists. And we've seen these threats emerge in Fort Dix and elsewhere inside the United States. I don't want to sound wildly exaggerating in terms of this threat, but the threat is real. It's there. And I take that challenge very seriously. And so some people might imagine that there's a temptation to make sure that bases are able to provide for their own security by gathering intelligence. Our policy, which I strongly support, is that bases are not going to get into the business of spying on American citizens in order to provide for the security of Department of Defense facilities. Instead, we rely on local and state law enforcement authorities. We've built a system of reliance on the folks who need to provide for awareness of potential threats, and they provide that back to the Department of Defense. We need to make sure that the Department of Defense is not becoming part of the problem of protection of civil liberties. We need to keep the Department of Defense where it is today under Secretary Gates and under President Obama as part of the solution, working together with our partners to make sure that civil liberties are protected, even as we build an even more effective system than we have today for federal, state, local intelligence and information sharing on potential threats. That's a great question.
A question here in the second row.
Thank you. A little while ago, you talked a little bit about the realm of policymaking, and you mentioned that we must capture the wisdom of states and localities when creating, executing, and shaping policy. So my question is, what steps has the Department of Defense taken to draw attention to the voices of the public?
Well, first of all, I want to offer a little recognition, a little praise for the Department of Homeland Security under Secretary Napolitano and Administrator Fugate of FEMA. There's a whole new world going on there. Under the Bush administration, terrific progress was made, especially in the aftermath of Katrina, in building this connectivity between the federal government, DHS, states, and localities. That progress is accelerating under the current team, and you can imagine why. Secretary Napolitano, former governor of the state of Arizona. She totally gets the authorities of governors and why states need to be responsible for the security of their own citizens. Craig Fugate, he ran emergency management in the state of Florida, where last time I checked, they get hurricanes all the time, and totally understands how to organize at the local and state level and interface with the federal government. And let's be candid, understand where maybe federal assistance, this federal, state, local integration, hasn't been adequate. He's all about building on the foundations that exist today. We're happy to be a partner with them as they move forward.
Next question. There's one way in the back on the left.
Thanks. Earlier you mentioned projects between neighbors in the Western Hemisphere that help the U.S. Could you please talk a bit about these projects and how they help the U.S. and how they help the neighbors with this cooperation?
You bet, and thank you for doing so. Let me emphasize again that Mexico is building a partnership with the United States that's unprecedented across a range of initiatives. So the first thing that leaps to mind is the brave efforts of the Mexican government to take down drug trafficking organizations at terrific cost inside of Mexico. President Obama finally said something that's been true for a long time, but had the courage to say it, and that is the United States is a big source of the security challenges that the Mexican people face today. And the southbound flow of illegal weapons and bulk cash, that's what the drug trafficking organizations feed off of, that then turn around, try to corrupt the Mexican police, undermine security, and participate in the killing of thousands of Mexican citizens. We're stepping up to the plate now, Department of Homeland Security, stepping up to the plate, beginning to clamp down on the southbound flow. Much more that we need to do in that realm. In the realm of disaster preparedness, again, Mexico sent vitally needed assistance across the border when Katrina struck, and we're continuing to strengthen those opportunities for collaboration. I was just down in Mexico City a couple of weeks ago for Grito to look for additional opportunities for collaboration. That's accelerating. And I look forward to coming back and reporting on progress to you next time that Dartmouth invites me back. Canada, we've got terrific opportunities to build on the foundation that exists today. Let me give you a prime example. The United States is doing plenty to support the government of Canada in anticipation of the Olympic Games in Vancouver. We want to make this a partnership. If bad things are in the minds of bad people about what to do in Vancouver, we intend to support our partners on the other side of the border in meeting those challenges. Obviously, Canada's providing the lion's share of these capabilities and the expertise, but the United States intends to support this. In the realm of natural hazards, plenty is going on to make sure that we have the compacts and the arrangements necessary for us to provide assistance on their side of the border, and very important to us, the other direction, because Canadian expertise and capabilities are so vitally needed on our side of the border where population is low and capabilities are thin for disaster response. This is happening not only federal government to federal government, but provinces and states and regions are beginning to build their own arrangements to help each other, reflecting the federal system of both nations. Federal system, which is absolutely terrific. Thanks.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Go ahead in the baseball hat here.
Good evening once again. My second question, I was watching MSNBC Morning Report the other day, and they spoke of how in November we will be withdrawing troops from Iraq. I was wondering if you might know, it might be within your portfolio to know, if there's any timetable of withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. I do know, of course, of the surge to Afghanistan, but I wondered if there was a timetable of removal from Afghanistan as well.
Well, as everybody in the room knows, in the aftermath of the report by General McChrystal, there's a strategic analysis, reanalysis underway throughout the United States government, in the Department of Defense, in the White House, and State Department. And this analysis is just getting underway, and I'm looking forward to the outcome of it. But as we talked about with regard to ballistic missile capabilities before, it's going to be driven on the assessment of facts on the ground. Facts on the ground, very, very challenging. So I don't mean to sugarcoat things. I have confidence in the decision makers who have this in their portfolio. And we're going to wait and see what the final decisions are.
Time for one more question. Yeah, right here in the second row.
Thank you for coming. I had a question. How do we maintain this kind of attentiveness to national security in the coming years and not kind of get caught sleeping, as you would say, like we did in September 11, 2001, and not allow, sorry about that, it's not allow something like that to happen again, because I feel like this decade, you know, eventually we're going to become, we're not going to forget what happened, but it's going to be in the back of our minds. And I feel like there's a potential that terrorists are going to hit when when we're not as attentive. And how do you keep that attentiveness?
Well, there is a narrow answer and a broad answer. The narrow answer is those of you who understand the risks of complacency and want to care about national security, write your senior thesis on that topic. Do coursework. I did. Of course, living in Harrod was a decisive advantage for me, as you can imagine. Nevertheless, if you care about that, continue to press forward in your own scholarship and insist that your professors work with you, because many of them are dealing with components that feed into security challenges. The risk of complacency is always there, although anybody reading newspapers lately knows that the bad guys really are out there and they're smart and adaptive. The broader answer, though, is let's make sure we understand security in an appropriate way. Security involves the life sciences to deal with the risk that H1N1 or some future flu virus could evolve in a way that poses catastrophic threats. Not caused by terrorists, caused by Mother Nature. Is it a threat to national security? You betcha. Across all of the disciplines represented in this room, there are opportunities to attack challenges in national security properly defined. So keep doing that, even if you're not a guns and bombs type person.
Well, partly in keeping with Paul being from the Secretary of Defense Office, it seems fitting to end it precisely at 6 o'clock. And I'd like to have all of you please thank him for being very generous of his time and answering questions for almost 1 hour. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks to you.